We'd like to thank ZRG, the registry, our sponsor for this episode. Learn how higher education institutions navigate change with proven interim leadership at zrgpartners.com/chronicle. This is College Matters from the Chronicle.
This is where it gets incredibly tricky because, of course, one person's institutional neutrality is another person's silence in the face of bigotry.
College is too expensive, too woke, and too risky an investment. These are a few of the most popular criticisms leveled at higher education today. But it's not just pundits and parents launching broadsides against the sector. It's college presidents, too. In a few notable cases of late, the leaders of some of the nation's highest-profile universities have made news for saying that higher ed's critics actually have a point. What's really driving today's self-critical college leaders? And are they helping or hurting higher education? We'll dive into that today with two of my colleagues at the Chronicle of Higher Education, Eric Kelderman and Nell Gluckman, who've both written about the college presidents who are taking shots at higher ed. Eric, Nell, welcome back to College Matters.
Thanks, Jack.
Great to be here.
Nell, let me start with you. Higher ed is under fire right now, and lots of college leaders are out there defending what colleges do, but there are some exceptions. A few are doing something different. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so like you said, there's been this loss of public trust. There is a sense that higher ed has kind of lost touch with the broad public. This criticism has come from the right traditionally. Years ago, it was J.D. Vance saying that universities are the enemy, and now J.D. Vance is in the White House, and a lot of people who share those views are in the White House. So there have been some college leaders who have pushed back and defended the sector, but a few notable ones, and I think this is a growing number, have kind of aligned themselves with some of this criticism at least and said that these people actually have a point about us. Some of those people are Daniel Diermeier, the chancellor of Vanderbilt University, Andrew Martin, the chancellor of Wash U, and Sion Beilock, the president of Dartmouth College.
And this is happening at a time of immense federal pressure on higher education. We've talked extensively on this show about Trump's campaigns against Ivy League institutions, and there's a big debate going on about whether these leaders are being sincere or is this sort of a cynical attempt to get on the good side of the Trump administration. But Eric, I want to turn to you because you recently did a deep dive into the presidency of Sion Beilock at Dartmouth, who's been among these outspoken figures. How does she fit into this larger story?
Right. Well, Dr. Beilock has been highly visible in her media appearances and has a couple of main critiques about higher education. The way she likes to describe this is colleges are educational institutions, not political or social justice institutions, and that colleges need to teach students how to think, not what to think. And to carry that out, on campus, she's instituted this policy of what's called institutional restraint, which is sort of a variation of the University of Chicago's institutional neutrality. And it basically means that the college administration, and in this case, department heads and deans, aren't going to make any official statements on things that aren't really directly related to the campus operations.
Now, I don't think any presidents are a monolith. We've grouped these people together because they all are making some critiques of higher education. But Nell, you've written more broadly about this movement. Do you see variations among the assorted presidents about how they're approaching this question?
Yeah, they all probably would agree with Beilock's institutional neutrality position. They all have different variations of it, but I think that's one thing they have in common, but they emphasize different things. So Diermeier at Vanderbilt, he talks a lot about how universities have to go back to their core mission of research, and he thinks that they sort of gave up on that mission for a while in favor of making political positions and allowed political leanings to infiltrate the type of research and the style of research that they did. So he thinks that is a fundamental problem at American universities right now, and that needs to be fought against pretty hard. And then, you have Beilock talking a lot about institutional neutrality and the importance of that. And then I think we should say that there are presidents on the other end of the spectrum who really don't agree necessarily that this is the posture that college presidents should take right now. Presidents like Chris Eisgruber at Princeton, who think that universities should be coming together as a group to push back against these criticisms and really fight the criticisms that have been leveled at higher education.
Yeah, so there's different flavors of this. I have been wondering how much of taking a position of institutional restraint or institutional neutrality is in and of itself a political act, because they're saying we need to depoliticize, but you're kind of aligning yourself with a certain section of the country, I think, if you say that colleges should cease to be moral actors, because what you really don't want colleges to do is weigh in on Israel and Palestine or issues around which people have really hardline positions. I think that the acid test for this was, of course, the college presidents who came before Congress and testified about anti-Semitism on their campuses. This was memorably the end of the presidential careers of Claudine Gay and Liz McGill, the presidents of Harvard and Penn, respectively. And the criticism there was that they gave highly legalistic answers, that rather than saying affirmatively, yes, Elise Stefanik, who was the congresswoman asking the questions in this case, calls for genocide against Jews on our campus certainly violate our code of conduct, and we would throw the book at any student who participated in such a thing. And that seemed, from the point of view of Elise Stefanik, who's got a new book coming out about all of this, she said this was not a political question. It was a moral one. I thought it was the easiest, most straightforward question of the hearing. This is from her new book, Poisoned Ivies, that's coming out soon. So in that case, institutional neutrality, not so great. We want college presidents to take very much moral stands. Do you think that this is a snake eating its tail? Is this an inherent contradiction in this debate about institutional neutrality?
This is where it gets incredibly tricky because, of course, one person's institutional neutrality is another person's silence in the face of bigotry. So in 2023, you had those presidents before Congress failing to take a firm stance against anti-Semitism in the eyes of a lot of the public and certainly Congresswoman Stefanik. But now there's all this push to, when it comes to the war in Gaza and other political issues, for presidents to just stay silent and not speak directly to them and let the experts do the talking about that sort of thing. It is an example of how tricky this really can be.
In practice, right? It's easy to set the policy, but hard in practice. What does Bylock say about those hearings, Eric?
You know, Bylock took a very strong stand in one of her podcast appearances. She called out Harvard directly, saying Claudine Gay's testimony was an example of a place that wasn't protecting students, wasn't, in her words, calling balls and strikes the way it needed to. I think what's rankled folks about Bylock's position is also that not only is she adopting it for her institution, but she's prescribing this as a solution for all of higher education.
Right. I have the answer. And you know, just to drill down one last time into this question about how institutional neutrality would work if you were trying to rein in pro-Palestinian protesters who were calling for genocide, this, again, an easy question for a politician. Maybe it's an easy question for Bylock too, but it's not an easy question for free speech experts. So the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression weighed in on this at the time and said, you know, actually most calls for genocide, as gross as they are protected speech. It's only when those calls constitute incitement or true threats that you're outside of the bounds of the First Amendment. Now, private colleges are not beholden to the First Amendment, but most of them try to abide by it in terms of their institutional ethos. If there's a severe and pervasive use of the term, it could qualify as harassment, but even that is a very high bar. So I guess I'm just saying all of this, that I'm realizing how sticky it is, and it seems to me that this is a very easy thing to talk about in a Wall Street Journal op-ed. But if you actually had a conversation for more than 20 minutes with a person about how institutional neutrality would work in practice, I think it gets very complicated very quickly, because you're invariably going to have two sets of values rub up against each other. One is a university's desire to divorce itself politically and morally from everything under the sun, and the other is for a university to actively monitor protests, ensuring that political speech never becomes harassment or intimidation. So this is about asking universities to sit back and lean in at the same time. Those are always going to be in tension.
That tension is clearly in play on Dartmouth's campus, where students from underrepresented groups feel like certain kinds of speech are protected, but not others, right? So flipping the script on what conservatives might say, which is conservative speech has been quashed for too long.
I talk to people who would agree with that, Eric, who worry that this new push for institutional neutrality might be making space for conservative speech on campus. It might be making place for what they would consider even bigoted speech on campus, but they're afraid that it will sort of disenfranchise or make campuses less friendly places for some of the people who have more recently felt more comfortable there. Students of color, scholars of color who have traditionally not had a place on some of the institutions that we've been talking about.
I am curious about the partisan split, though, on a bigger question, which is about affordability. Affordability is a big reason that people in this country are concerned about higher education. The culture war issue is very interesting to talk about, but it becomes a pocketbook issue for a lot of families. And I wonder what these presidents have to say about affordability. They're all from pretty gilded institutions.
They do talk about affordability as an important piece of their push to make their colleges more appealing to what they see as like the masses in the United States. All of them, these places like Dartmouth and Vanderbilt and WashU and the Ivies generally have really fantastic financial aid packages for students. A place like WashU, for example, I know Andrew Martin, the chancellor there, talks about this a bit and how he's really worked to bring more students from Missouri, where the college is located, to WashU and offered more financial aid. The challenge I think that they all have is that they are unique in the higher ed landscape. They have huge endowments and serve very small numbers of students. I mean, yes, they give them a lot of financial aid, but this is a minuscule part of the college-going population. And
yeah, there's like 4,500 students at Dartmouth. Right. To put that in perspective, there's like 35,000 at UCLA.
Right. So most colleges, universities can't offer that kind of financial aid that they offer, and also serve huge, much bigger parts of the population.
And they're serving some of the richest people in the country. I don't mean to pick on Dartmouth, but they're part of this conversation, obviously. And if you look at Raj Chetty's data on family income, Dartmouth is a college that serves very wealthy people. It's something like 21% of their students come from the top 1% of the family income scale in this country. That data came out in 2017, so it's a little dated now. Still, it's fair to question whether the leader of a college with such wealthy students can sound credible on the affordability issue. But what really struck me, Eric, in your interview that you had with Bylock was that she talked about seeing a value in speaking for the mission of elite higher ed, which is not something that I often hear a college president of any sort actually acknowledge, that there is an elite higher education and that elite higher education has a particular mission. And I've been sort of wrestling with what that could mean. It could mean, we're Dartmouth, I have a big megaphone, I intend to use it. It could also mean that this conversation in her quarters is not really about speaking to all of America. It's about speaking to a very small slice of America that has outsized influence on putting people in positions of great power in this country. So if you go to an Ivy League school, it's actually in the conversation that you could be president of the United States. It's in the conversation that you could be a Supreme Court justice. It's certainly in the conversation that you could work at Goldman Sachs. So these are people that are going to end up in very influential institutions in society. And maybe Bylock is saying something quite refreshing here, which is these are people who are going to have great influence on the direction of the country, even though there's only 4,500 of them at any given time. And in light of that, we feel an even deeper need to give them an education that is rounded both academically and intellectually, but also politically. Do you think that might be part of what's driving that position, Eric?
Boy, that's a fascinating question. And in my very brief interview with her, she did talk about supporting the mission of Lead Higher Education, and we didn't really have time to go into what that what that mission meant.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, I think there's an acknowledgement that they are at the upper echelons of prestige in higher education, however you want to measure that, and that they do have a duty to educate, I guess, future leaders, right? And we expect many of these people to go on to prominent positions in society.
I think what I'm leading to, Eric, is this a luxurious conversation? Is this a conversation that people have the time to have at the Dartmouths and Princetons, but people who are actually in the trenches educating large swaths of the American public really are not in this conversation at all?
Oh, that's exactly right. I mean, I sometimes describe the Ivy League as a herd of unicorns. To put it in perspective, you were talking about numbers earlier. All of the Ivy League combined has undergraduate populations like a fraction of 1% of all undergrads, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, Dartmouth is doing better at getting Pell income students in. I think their figure's around 20%, but traditionally they've been much lower than that. They have one of the least diverse populations of undergrads on campus, and their faculty is almost 70% white, which is much, much higher percentage than the rest of the Ivy League. So this is a privileged conversation, and in many ways, it doesn't apply to the rest of higher education, certainly not on the financial aid picture where, yeah, if you make less than $175,000, sure, you're going to go to Dartmouth for almost nothing. But they only admit 6% of their applicants.
And I want to be fair to Bylock. We're talking about them because they're at high-profile institutions, because she's on Morning Joe, because she has these op-eds. So she's proving her point to me. I concede that, yeah.
I think that this conversation is coming for other parts of higher education. You have people in different parts of the country putting more political people, and you've written about this, Jack, on boards and in presidencies, places like the University of West Florida, North Idaho College, which is a community college, have all seen these political conversations about how higher education has become too leftist, too woke. And in some cases, these colleges are like, what do you mean? Like you were saying, Jack, we don't really have time for this conversation. We're teaching people about welding.
But the boards do have time and the governors have time. You're right about that now.
There's this feeling that all of higher education is taken over by the left, which I think a lot of people would vehemently disagree with.
Stick around. We'll be back in a minute. If there's one thing higher education rarely gets, it's a convenient moment for leadership change. A president leaves, a provost steps away, a cabinet role opens up, and the institution has to keep moving. ZRG, the registry, helps colleges and universities bridge these moments with proven interim leaders who know how to step in, steady the institution, and keep priorities moving. As part of ZRG, that support goes even further. See how institutions are navigating change with more continuity and less disruption at zrgpartners.com/chronicle. If you're trying to keep up with new academic books, you already know the problem. There's more coming out than anyone can possibly read. That's why New Books Network is the best resource for scholars and deep readers to keep up with new research and writing in their field. New Books Network is a massive collection of long-form interviews with scholars and authors, almost 30,000 conversations on the site across history, politics, literature, science, you name it. You'll hear directly from the authors who lay out their arguments and research methods. New Books Network also works closely with academic publishers, including partnerships with Princeton University Press, Oxford University Press, and MIT Press. So it's a great way to stay current with the kinds of books that shape actual conversations in higher ed. If you want a smart, efficient way to discover books worth taking seriously, go to newbooksnetwork.com. That's newbooksnetwork.com.
I'm Shankar Vedantam, here to tell you about a great mystery. That mystery is you. As the host of a podcast called Hidden Brain, I explore big questions about what it means to be human. Questions like, where do our emotions come from? Why do so many of us feel overwhelmed by modern life? How can we better understand the people around us? Discover your hidden brain. Find us wherever you get your podcasts.
There's also a position that it's because of this liberal rot in higher education that Americans have turned against higher education. And I was curious to think more about that, so I looked at this survey from the Pew Research Center that's often cited. This came out in October, and the headline is 7 in 10 Americans now say the higher education system in the United States is generally going in the wrong direction. And this is up from 56% who said it in 2020. So that is true. There is a loss of public confidence in this sector for a variety of reasons. What's interesting to me is that Democrats and Republicans, or people who identify as such, are in very close alignment when it comes to the question of whether higher ed is doing a bad job on affordability. I think it's like 80% from both parties say that that's true. But things get a lot more diverted when you look at culture war issues. So the question of whether colleges are exposing students to a wide range of opinions. That's a central critique from the right, that if you're a conservative student, you just don't hear the conservative point of view on something like Israel and Palestine. Well, that's a very partisan issue. 61% of Republicans say that colleges are doing a fair to poor job on that particular question. Only 29% of Democrats feel that way. So this is a very partisan division around this central question of whether the reason that people have lost faith in higher education is because it's too ideological. Republicans think that. It doesn't look to me like Democrats necessarily do.
Can I add a point here, which I think is really interesting? And I think one complication of having people like Daniel Diermeyer and Sion Beilock and others in the spotlight speaking for higher education is that the American public then tends to think that these institutions are representative of higher education more broadly, right? Without really understanding that, even a public flagship doesn't have the luxury and resources and prestige of an Ivy League like a Harvard or a Princeton or a Dartmouth. And I think that becomes a complicating issue here. And many people might think, for instance, the Supreme Court's decision on using race in admissions that somehow undoes some illegal admissions practices that have been practiced. But in fact, even that decision affects just a narrow slice of higher education broadly.
So few colleges in this country are selective at all, as you said.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's true. And I think the fact that college broadly is being painted as too ideologically rigid in some ways bolsters the position of some of Diermeyer's and Beilock's critics. Higher ed's defenders are saying, look, you think you can stop political intrusion by making reforms yourself? But that doesn't necessarily work. Republican appointees are already rooting out DEI, going after sociology and other curricula. And every day we see the Trump administration trying to wrestle autonomy away from universities on a broad range of issues. There's really nowhere to hide. Being more neutral politically has not saved the institutions who are feeling that.
Well, it has saved Dartmouth to a certain extent, and I think this is an important point, which is it's the only Ivy League college that has not faced some sort of investigation or punitive action from the Trump administration. They haven't had any of their grants frozen. They haven't had any Title VI or Title IX investigations. That's clearly one of the motivations of President Beilock, which is to buffer the institution from the financial and reputational harm that might come from that. And so far, it's worked.
And yet Dartmouth is a party to at least one lawsuit against this administration, right?
They have signed on to an amicus brief. I believe it had to do with research funding. But Beilock did not sign, for instance, an open letter that was signed by 600 other college presidents, which condemned the administration's attacks on Harvard. And that again, became another flashpoint on campus, and a reason that critics would say she is leaning into the sort of MAGA message.
People who support that approach, I think, would say this is exactly the right balance. If something is illegal, you fight it in court. If you have an opinion on something, you don't sign some symbolic letter with 100 other university presidents saying, I'm mad.
I think that's true, yeah.
This gets at some of the tension, I think, at these institutions. The tension is between people like Eisgruber who say we have to come together and push back against this, And, maybe your institution isn't going to face these cuts, but others are, and we should all care about that. But inherently, these institutions are really competitive with each other. They're competitive for students, for funding. And I think you're seeing some of that play out too, that they haven't always worked together on certain things.
Well, how much is this a piece of that competitive puzzle? How much branding is going on here? Because I think that 10 years ago, if you were a right-leaning family, you might send your kid to Liberty University, an evangelical college in Virginia, then led by Jerry Falwell Jr., a paragon of morality.
You forgot to do the air quotes, but yeah.
But in any case, now your options might be grander. Now you might be able to say, I'm not in for a session of Sunday school every day for my student, but I don't want them to have to participate in a pro-Palestinian protest every 2 weeks. And Dartmouth's my bag. It does seem like this opens that up for the institutions to carve out an image there, but also for the individual presidents. I've been very interested in that because a lot of college presidents are sort of ducking for cover in this environment right now. There are a few exceptions, but many of them are just hoping they're not noticed. These folks want to be noticed, and it's not just their institutions that are getting noticed, it's the presidents themselves.
President Beilock has been very intentional about putting herself into the media. Now, when she talked to me, she said she doesn't do it just for the limelight's sake, right? She's not doing that for that, but she is putting herself out there as a messenger for her institution and for the sector. But it's not an accident that she's ending up on, the pages of prominent news publications or on these podcasts or news broadcasts. She has a very high-powered public relations firm that works for her, along with a small army of communication staff on Dartmouth's campus as well. So it's not that folks are reaching out to her because she's got an appealing message. That might be part of it at least, but she's being placed into those situations on purpose.
Yeah, these people's profiles have definitely risen. People like Diermeyer and Beilock and to some extent Andrew Martin at WashU as well. They are putting themselves out there. They are going on podcasts. They are talking to the press. They are writing op-eds, whether it's in the Chronicle or the Wall Street Journal or the Atlantic. They are trying to be heard on this. This is not us going in and parsing their statements to their faculty senates or something. They're being pretty public about this and trying to, I think, gain a reputation as somebody who's speaking the truth and maybe speaking a little bit more directly to some of the concerns that have been growing about higher education over the last few years. Diermeyer and Martin have gone so far as to form a group, they're calling it Universities for America's Future, where they're bringing together like-minded college leaders and having meetings and talking about these kinds of reforms. And I think that signals that they're not just trying to talk about this. I think they're trying to really create a movement here and bring other people along with them.
We started by talking about institutional neutrality and talked about what a complex issue that is. There's a relatively new book out from Stephen Poskancer, who's emeritus president of Carleton College. We'll link to it in the show notes. It's called The University's Voice, Principled Silence and Purposeful Speech. Came out late last year. And I'm still reading through it, but he argues that the default position for any university ought to be institutional reticence. Everybody has a different term for this. But one of the reasons he gives is that we need to have intellectual modesty about being wrong. It's not always clear-cut that we have the right answer to a given fiery question in the culture, and we ought to be cognizant of that. And it'd be hard to disagree with that. And so given sort of the commonsensical nature of that position, I wonder whether you think this might be catching on. And not only institutional neutrality, but the broader idea that colleges ought to practice more humility about areas in which they don't have it right. Because at the end of the day, that's what these criticisms are about.
I think it is catching on. There's some institutions who aren't going to feel like they need to adopt any kind of position about this, but I think it's gaining traction. And I think one sign of that is that even the president of Harvard University, Alan Garber, has sort of made statements that kind of align with some of what we're hearing from these more self-critical presidents. He went on a podcast not too long ago and talked about how college students really do need to be taught at Harvard and places like that how to be better at accepting different views that they're not super comfortable with, but that may be challenging to them and help them grow intellectually. And he's certainly spoken about problems with anti-Semitism on college campuses as well. And I think this is notable coming from him because Harvard is locked in a legal battle with the Trump administration over their research funding cuts and has very publicly come out swinging, fighting against some of this, and got a lot of support, public support from people on campuses who want to see their leaders pushing back. But then in these comments, in a one-on-one conversation, with an audience, of course, but he did sort of say, yeah, our critics do have a point, and there are some things that we need to work to fix. So I think that was a pretty telling moment that argument is gaining traction, and we'll see more of it.
Yeah, well, we'll certainly continue to follow it and see what happens. But I thank you both so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jack.
My pleasure. Thanks.
College Matters from the Chronicle is a production of the Chronicle of Higher Education, the nation's leading independent newsroom covering colleges. If you like the show, please leave us a review or invite a friend to listen. And remember to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts so that you never miss an episode. You can find an archive of every episode, all of our show notes, and much more at chronicle.com/College Matters. If you like, drop us a note at collegematters@chronicle.com. We are produced by Rococo Punch. Our Chronicle producer is Fernanda Zamudio Suarez. Our podcast artwork is by Cottrell Thomas. Special thanks to our colleagues Brock Reed, Sarah Brown, Carmen Mendoza, Ron Coddington, Joshua Hatch, and all of the people at the Chronicle who make this show possible. I'm Jack Stripling. Thanks for listening. We'd like to thank ZRG, the Registry, our sponsor for this episode. Learn how higher education institutions navigate change with proven interim leadership at zrgpartners.com/chronicle. Nobody covers international higher education like my colleague Karen Fisher. And now you get Karen's best reporting and most thoughtful analysis delivered directly to your inbox with her newsletter, Latitudes. Latitudes examines the economic, cultural, and political divides that shape and drive higher education's global relationships and reach. From study abroad programs to the effects of geopolitics on colleges, Karen covers it all. Sign up for free at chronicle.com/getnewsletters.